Ciao, I am Renato Floris, the publisher of all the scholarly and entertaining books on Rudolph Valentino and Natasha Rambova by Evelyn Zumaya. I am here today with Evelyn to discuss more about her fascinating work. Ciao, Evelyn.
Ciao, Renato. In this episode, I thought we could discuss Rudolph Valentino's Health and Wealth. Now, I know the idiom is usually health is wealth or health wealth, but I'm putting a twist on that today. I'm going to make it health brings wealth. Perhaps this is an episode about Valentino's efforts to prosper, whether it be his physical fitness or his financial fitness, his drive to thrive, to flourish, to be prosperous. And obviously, because of the world's intense focus on his handsome self, his physical fitness was absolutely important and a contributor to his vast personal wealth. His body was a very valuable asset, all in all. As a youth, Valentino was very athletic, but he was refused admittance to a military academy because he fell a few inches short of the required chest measurements. Now, this even though Italy's king at the time, the head of the Italian military, Vittorio Emanuele III, was only 5 feet tall. So I'm not sure what the standard was, Renato, based upon that, but I think Valentino's humiliation at being refused entrance to the military academy inspired him to put more emphasis on his physical presence. Today I read a caption on one image of Valentino where he was lifting weights in 1923. And it read that for Valentino his exercise, and I quote, protects him from the dread of the cinema star, the avoirdupois, the career-ending possibility of weight gain. But I think this was something he did not have to worry about too much in 1923. So Valentino was expected to keep himself in shape. And in this, his employers, I think they exploited every opportunity for cheesecake. How else to say it? But it was pretty objectifying at times. To photograph his workouts and all those poses with bodybuilder muscles flexed, and those images are many. He's seen boxing, lifting weights, horseback riding, swimming, fencing, playing tennis. But this physical perfection in form became an important aspect of his image, and I can say he did not seem so shy about showing off his body. He was a pretty good sport about that. But his physical activities were not just for the benefit of the cameras. If you notice his body in his earlier films and compare that with how he looked, say, in The Eagle and The Son of the Sheik, it's obvious he was working out, especially lifting weights. So I think his physical fitness did matter to him, but perhaps not as much as it was proposed. I think he also loved to eat, drink, and be very merry. So therein lies this debate. There was working out, and then there was the subject of healthy lifestyle, and those two, for me, are not always one. You know, Renato, the concept of combining diet with exercise was in great measure due to the proselytizing of Gassou publisher Bernard Macfadden. We've talked about him quite a bit in the past few episodes, but he plays a role in any discussion of physical fitness and Rudolph Valentino. I think Macfadden had a great deal to do with Valentino being marketed and remembered as a fitness fanatic and expert.
He published a book of exercises and diet advice by Valentino, didn't he?
Yes, Bernard Macfadden published How You Can Keep Fit by Rudolph Valentino in 1923. And this book consists of lengthy descriptions of exercises, each with an accompanying full-page illustration of Valentino posing in that exercise posture. He's wearing nearly nothing at all, by the way, and for listeners who have not seen this book, it is available as a free PDF download online, and it's in public domain, so you can Google it and download it from archive.org. But in any case, Macfadden was one of, if not the greatest fitness evangelist at the time. He lived what he preached and ate like a god, walked barefoot to work, and worked out fanatically. He founded the Physical Culture magazine and opened a restaurant in New York City called Physical Culture, one of New York City's first vegetarian venues. But his was a new concept of fitness, in that it combined bodybuilding and diet. And this was his theme, which is also heavily reinforced in Valentino's book, How You Can Keep Fit, such as Chapter 5, titled Let Your Abdomen Have the Strength of Iron Bands, where the value of core strength is actually discussed, something Macfadden espoused on. And Chapter 8, Better Eating for Harder Working. On page 66, Valentino is advising the use of mineral salts. So these are all Bernard Macfadden tenets, his liturgy. So it's my opinion, after reading some of Macfadden's writings on fitness, such as in, I think the book is called Vitality Supreme, that although Valentino was certainly involved in the making of this little book, I suspect he might not have written it. It is not only my opinion because of the content of the narrative, but because of the style of the writing as well. Macfadden was a prolific writer about these very subjects, and his style of writing was so Charles Dickens. He even emulated the style of Charles Dickens. It's a serious tone focusing on the bettering of the human race. But Macfadden wrote frenetically and sincerely wanted to impress his health message on the masses, to whom he sold millions of books and newspapers. So it's not such a stretch of the imagination to think that Macfadden appreciated Valentino's perfect features and exploited this to its fullest, obviously, but to have his own message spread by marketing it through Valentino and in the process making some money.
Did Macfadden write his own fitness books?
He did, Renato, and some of them titled things like Muscular Power and Beauty, Hair Culture, Fasting, Hydrotherapy, Exercise, Strengthening the Eyes, and that was it, Vitality Supreme, The Walking Cure, How to Cure Headaches, How to Gain Weight, How to Lose Weight. And a lot of them were how-to health books. And many of them include Macfadden posing in the same bodybuilding poses, in the same type of shorts or briefs as those poses Valentino made in How You Can Keep Fit. On the subject of Valentino's book, How You Can Keep Fit, and Bernard Macfadden, I have to read a little excerpt. Again, from this great book, Sauce for the Gander by Frank Mallon, which I have referenced in previous episodes. Mallon worked as the picture editor for the New York Evening Graphic, the tabloid, in the late 1920s. Now, I read this because I think it sheds light on the disparities that certainly existed between Macfadden's high physical fitness standards, as reflected in Valentino's poses and How You Can Keep Fit, and the reality of what was probably going on. I'm going to read from page 9, and I quote, "When it came to smoking or drinking, which he, Macfadden, abhorred as body wreckers, his philosophy has been that if people, even close friends, were satisfied with shorter lives their way than longer ones his way, that was solely their business and none of his." In this connection, his relationship with Fulton Oursler, his top magazine editor, later to become one of the greatest writers of our time, stands out as testimony to his tolerance and forbearance. He shared an apartment for 5 years with Oursler, who frequently expressed violent disagreement with his views. Macfadden would listen for hours without a flicker of protest, as Oursler's desecrated his principles while chain-smoking and tossing highballs. Despite these eruptions, the two practically worshipped each other. Macfadden felt Oursler's death was untimely due to indulgence in the very things he had warned against. End quote. So, Renato, the frustrations Macfadden must have felt with his friend Oursler smoking and drinking, dying young, do you not think the same was true of his friendship with Valentino? Macfadden promoted Valentino in How You Can Keep Fit, perhaps and probably with his own message of health as the manuscript. But with Valentino smoking, according to Ullman, 100 cigarettes a day, he had to be somewhat out of breath as time went on. And his diet of pasta, wine, caviar, which he loved, he was hardly the vegetarian green salad eating type to me. Considering the fact that the book was published just as George Ullman came on board to promote Valentino and jumpstart his screen career, It's reasonable to presume that this could have been a fabulous publicity production between Macfadden, Ullman, and Valentino. So before we move on from how you can keep fit, Renato, I have to comment on that Italian diet, something we know a lot about in this household.
Yes, well,
and I am sure today there are more and more Italians eating vegan and vegetarian diets and more into their health, but it's doubtful to me that Valentino gave up the carbs and wines and the cheeses, and there's plenty of evidence attesting to that.
yeah, Valentino was very much a fan of the sport of boxing, wasn't he?
He was. That's a good point. And despite what was written as fact in that horrid book, Valentino, an intimate and shocking expose by Steiger and Mank, in which they say Valentino's boxing was just an attempt to prove he was, quote, a real man. Valentino was a sincere fan of and participant in the sport of boxing. And by the way, that book is the second worst book ever written on Valentino. Full of innuendo, fictional, salacious anecdotes with no basis in fact. And I have to take the opportunity here to add one more time that I find the entire real man thing very homophobic. One's sexual orientation and gender identity has nothing to do with the sports you enjoy. That's incredibly archaic thinking. So George Ullman was also a fan of boxing, and he did box professionally when he was young, living in New York City. When he got married and he had his first son, he and his wife Bea had their first son, Dan, he decided it was not a secure career to follow and he quit. But he and Valentino would lace on the boxing gloves and spar. And I'm going to cite a passage from Affairs Valentino, a paragraph from page 247 about that. And I quote, Rudy and George shared a passionate interest in boxing, and they were not only active participants in the sport, but avid fans. One of George's first orders of business upon his arrival in Los Angeles was the purchase of a block of 8 seats in the American Legion Arena. There, without exception, every Friday night, the Valentinos and the Ullmans were seated ringside. Usually decked out in a beret, a pair of knickers, and a tweed sport coat, Rudy cheered in Italian if an Italian pugilist was in the ring, and in English if the boxer was American. On a few occasions, he cheered in Spanish, along with actress Lupe Velez, for the American Legion's Mexican boxers. The crowd always knew when Rudy was in the stadium. He was loud, especially after he had a few drinks. So, of course, there is the notable boxing match in New York City that fateful summer of 1926, with Valentino punching a sparring partner before the gathered press, because the author of that deplorable pink powder puff editorial had not come forth to accept his challenge to a boxing duel.
You told me how Ullman was very worried about this.
He was, because the mighty United Artists Studios contract Valentino had signed had a disfigurement clause. I actually have that here, incredibly. And the United Artists contract, now I can cite it from page 221, but that is actually not page 221 of the contract. It is from the court records as they are filed in the California Court of Appeals. So I read from page 221 from his contract. The producer shall be entitled to injunction and other equitable relief to prevent any breach of this agreement by the artist. Should the artist become incapacitated by physical or mental illness or disability from preventing them from rendering said services, and should such incapacity continue for a period of aggregate of periods of more than 6 weeks during the term of this agreement, or should he suffer any permanent facial or physical disfigurement materially detracting from his appearance as a motion picture actor or interfering with his ability to perform properly the required services hereunder, the producer, at his option, may terminate the employment. So, if anything were to disfigure Valentino's face at all, then the entire deal with United Artists would be off. So, of course, Ullman guarded Valentino's valuable face and was quick to call an end to the promotional boxing match. But I think by then, by 1926, Valentino was facing health issues, and a lot had happened since he and Macfadden published How You Can Keep Fit in 1923. But despite this, If you look at his biceps in The Son of the Sheik, you can see what he did after he and Natasha separated. I think he just went to the gym. He really buffed up and fast. But his fitness habits, as far as his advice given in how you can keep fit, they were in question. With his new favorite drink being a beer and champagne cocktail. And I'm going to cite Variety from Wednesday, January 6, 1926, in the, quote, News from the Dailies, New York, and I read, Rudolph Valentino and Laura Gould, former wife of George Gould, Jr., were winners in a dance contest at Mitchell's, a colored cabaret in Montmartre, France. The tabloid's account said that Rudolph was greeted with a burst of applause upon entering the cafe. He grabbed his newest and favorite drink, a mixture of beer and champagne, and upon finishing it, also grabbed Laura and did his newest and favorite dance, a mixture of the tango and the Charleston, end quote. So, thank you, Variety, for that great item. So, somewhere between those black tobacco cigarettes, those black velvets, I guess that's what they call those stout beer and champagne cocktails, they do now anyways, the Canadian whiskey, Valentino's fitness routine suffered, obviously. But the image of an active Valentino was always evident, the images of those fencing lessons, his horseback riding, and I will be posting some little videos of Valentino boxing and fencing on the Affairs Valentino Instagram account soon, by the way. So now we turn from muscle to money, and I've already pointed out a connection there. The marketing of Valentino was in great measure due to marketing the lure of the flesh. His fans delighted in seeing his muscular body, which was always of high value to him financially.
Of course, Valentino was a wealthy young man, but he did have some strange spending habits.
He did, yes. I think the story of his financial management, or lack thereof, before George Ullman begins with their first conversation. This took place on the Mineral Lava Tour when Valentino told Ullman that the tour could not play in Los Angeles because he owed so much money he feared he would be thrown in jail. And I'm going to read the excerpt about that from Affairs Valentino, page 173. And I quote, Before the conversation turned to the specifics of the tour, Rudy took George aside to inform him of his troubling financial situation in Los Angeles. He told him it was imperative the tour avoid Los Angeles at all costs, at least until he could settle a few accounts with his angry bill collectors. Rudy went on to say his situation was so grave he feared he would be thrown in jail if he did step foot in the city. George pressed Rudy for a few details regarding this grave situation, but assured him it sounded as if none of the judgments held against him were based on any criminal offenses. He said he would look into the matter and then turned the discussion to the logistics of their journey. End quote. So Valentino seems consistently to have spent way more than he earned, which is always a problem. Being Rudolph Valentino, he certainly had little trouble convincing people to loan him money, extend him broad lines of credit, but even Ullman was rather powerless to stem the wild spending by Valentino. He purchased everything from guns to antique armor to furniture, art, clothing, dogs, horses. It was his incredible love of shopping, a high need for heavy retail therapy, I guess. He was hardly shopping in thrift stores. But this said, after Valentino hired Ullman as his business manager, it was George Ullman who carried the cash. George wrote in his 1975 memoir that Valentino could be difficult in dispensing cash on hand, but if he could sign for something on credit, he was extravagant. I think we've discussed many instances of Valentino's philanthropy in the past podcast episodes, and this appears something he did welcome, though. He was a generous person, I would say.
So, what was his worth? How do you calculate something like that?
Well, actually calculating the exchange rate from 1926 to 2018 is times 13. So this puts the numbers into proportion, but the court records I discovered included extracts of a court-ordered audit by Harry Baskerville. And those were very interesting, as Ullman's bookkeeping had to be submitted for review, and this covered a time frame, the entire time frame of the last 6 months of Valentino's life. It was not so easy to analyze it all, and even though I was and had been accused of forging all of those documents, absurdity of that knows no bounds, by the way, it took me a great deal of time and effort to understand all of it. But Valentino's business was complicated by 1926, with his various investments, his supporting a laboratory called Cosmic Arts, and more about Cosmic Arts in a future podcast, and the running of his own production company, in addition to supporting a substantial household staff. So his overhead was very high for the day. He lived like a king, I would say. I have here today from those court documents, giving some idea of his wealth, a document titled The Accounting and Objections Thereto, which itemizes Valentino's assets at the time. And remember, the numbers are all times 13. The listing in Ullman's books, which he has submitted here, being as assets, real property, personal property, including money that Valentino had in the banks, his 43.75% interest in his motion pictures, The Eagle, the son of the Sheik, his interest in the cleaners, in rec service, his cars, his life insurance, everything is itemized. Then there are some adjustments with the total of his wealth at the time, $490,000 and $490,223.37 times 13. This would be $6,372,903.81. Now, I understand that the finances might not be the sexiest and most interesting thing to talk about Valentino. Not as entertaining, perhaps, as watching him sweat in a pair of shorts, but it certainly reveals who he really was, and it tells the exact story of his money, his wealth, his drive for prosperity, even if he died with an enormous debt. He had several bank accounts in Los Angeles, New York City, and in Paris. And when he was traveling, George Ullman would send wire transfers to his various bank accounts. But the concept of Valentino, the Valentino of 1923, at 28 years old, expounding on keeping fit becomes sort of a tragic irony by 1926. Instead of eating, cleansing greens and working out, which he was promoting in 1923, he was downing whiskey and eating Russian caviar by the tablespoonful, with 1 week's Ritz-Carlton hotel tab for the caviar alone totaling $100. Now, which would be today $1,300 worth of caviar. And you know, Renato, despite those incredible paychecks from United Artists throughout 1925 and 1926, Valentino was so crippled by his debt that a consolidation loan was negotiated, the cinema finance loan. But best to read about the details about that in Affairs Valentino. But suffice to say that his spending reached its ultimate height in the months before his death.
So you mentioned that Ullman carried the cash. What do you mean by that?
On that, I'm going to explain that by reading one other little excerpt from Affairs Valentino. An anecdote is told by George Ullman. I quote page 232. Just inside Grand Central Station's 42nd Street entrance, an elderly man sat slumped on a folding chair next to his small display of fruit. His handwritten cardboard sign read, "For sale." It was a nippy spring evening in early May, and business was not brisk. So when 3 well-dressed New Yorkers paused to eye his fruit, he rallied with a pitch. Fresh plums, fresh, juicy plums. The old man's hopes for a sale at that moment were pinned on Rudy, Natasha, and George. But at that late hour, the weary vendor did not recognize the handsome movie star bending down to select one of his plums. "How much?" Rudy asked. 10 cents, the man replied. Rudy raised an eyebrow, set the plum back in the crate, and looked the vendor in the eye. "I won't pay 10 cents for a prune." Natasha ignored Rudy's rebuke and began filling a small paper bag with the plums, while George stepped forward to count out the change for the purchase. Rudy didn't sputter long about the indignity of paying a dime for a plum, and before walking another city block, he was munching on the fruit, end quote. So, Renato, in discussing Ullman's complex role, in reading those anecdotes, I think those people who continue to vilify him, they insult the intelligence of Valentino. And in this I have always given Valentino way more credit. He had good taste in people, not bad, and knew his business when he delegated to Ullman. Of course, in 1926, at 31 years of age, he and 32-year-old Ullman were not exactly planning for the disaster that would come. At that age, despite a profoundly painful divorce, Valentino was, still very young, and he thought that way. I am sure he had every confidence he could clear any debt, but Ullman was worried and concerned at the time, and this was most evident. But the vilification of Ullman is so completely without merit, Renato. It's so cruel. Because after years of analysis of those court records and fact-checking the statement I just made, the opposite was true. Ullman had a stressful job managing Rudolph Valentino, and he did so with grace, style, and kindness. Their friendship and trust endured until Valentino's last moments, and whether they were hashing out the terms of a new contract or sparring with the boxing gloves on, they were good friends and respected each other, and that is obvious. So, for today, Renato, on a positive thought, are you going to make us a couple of black velvet cocktails, or do we get to go to the gym?
Yes, let's go to the gym.
Oh.
Let's stay fit.
Okay.
And as the usual, fiat justitia ruat caelum. And for the good guys, arrivederci.